I would like to welcome you to our panel that is going to focus on communicating on Europe, citizens' perspectives and of the EU and its reform. I would like, before starting, to welcome our panelists. On my left side, Mr. Debomy, who is Associate Research Fellow at Institut Jacques Delors in Paris. He's also a founder and a managing director of opinion polls institute Optem. So he has a long experience in observing evolutions of the public opinions in different member states with regards to the EU. I would like to welcome also Kasia Wojcik, further down on my left. She is a theater artist, but she's also, more importantly for our debate, an elected member of the Democracy Europe Movement 2025 in Germany, known also under the abbreviation DM25. And I would like to welcome also Eliza Korenska, who is a PhD candidate and researcher at the Leiden University Institute for Public Affairs, and has been extensively focusing on themes of public discourse in different member states in relation to the EU. So let's start. We only have 1 hour. We will start discussing between the panelists, and we will allow questions at the end for roughly 20-25 minutes, depending on the interventions, and from the public or from Slido. So you can also participate to the debate by either putting in your questions or liking the questions that somebody else put in. So we will be taking that into regard. All the information, you can find it on the screen on my left. So let's look at this Europe today. We have European Union that has gone through quite a turbulent last 10 years, if you take account the economic, financial crisis, and followed by the migration one. And everything seems to be going much better nowadays. Economy in most member states have been stabilized. Perceptions of and hopes of the European citizens towards their future became more positive. So is the time ripe for a reform of the European Union, of this European project that many have been advocating for? Are the citizens ready for it? What is it that they really want from the European project? Are they ready for major reform, or have they grown through the last 10 years rather skeptical? So I would first like to ask Mr. Debomy, based on a couple of elements I will mention from our latest Eurobarometer about the feelings among the EU citizens. Basically, it has been found out last week that 42%, which is the highest level since 2010, 32% of Europeans trust the EU. Now, there is quite a wide difference. 66% of Lithuanians trust the EU, 57% of Danish trust the EU, but there are 34% of French, 36% of Italians. Those are rather important countries, quite large discrepancies. So although we have this impression that things are going much better today, is it really true? If you look at that from the perspective of your experience of those last 25, 30 years, you've been following the opinions of the citizens in different member states and their relations to the European project, are we really doing much better, or have there been better phases, or actually aren't we idealizing it today? And people felt quite stressed already 15 years ago.
Well, is it all right?
Should be.
I will not go back 15 years back. I will go back 30x years back, okay?
Very useful for all of us.
To me, to the beginning of human history, as far as I'm concerned, that is the day when Jacques Delors took over the presidency of the European Commission. You will understand me. Okay. Well, actually, I started working on European public opinion back in those years, together with Delors and Pascal Lamy, for the first studies I did. And I had the occasion of carrying out some 100 qualitative studies, in addition to looking at figures from Eurobarometer notably. Now, right, you were right to state that over the last few years, the situation has improved. The situation which can be measured by such indicators as membership indicator, being a member of the EU is a good thing or a bad thing, or neither good nor bad for my countries, and my country has benefited or not from being a member. It has clearly improved over the last 4 years. The last measurement show another +3% since last autumn. Okay? But you have to look back over the past. Okay? When I started looking at this back in the 1985 or so, the figures were rather good, not enthusiastically good. It went up until roughly 1991, 92. Okay? Probably because the citizens in different countries realized that someone, Delors namely, was proposing something. Okay? And then after the 91, 92, it went dramatically down for 5 years or so. We could discuss the reasons for it at length. Okay, I don't think we have the time to do it.
You can mention main 2 or 3 to
yeah, 2 or 3 reasons.
Understand.
Well, the controversies over the Maastricht Treaty in a number of countries. Secondly, the dismantling of Yugoslavia, which gave the impression that peace, which we thought was gained forever, maybe was in danger just next door. And also the fact that the EU didn't appear to be extremely able to deal with the situation, at least in the first years, okay? And also economic growth tended to abate at that time. These maybe were 3 factors. Anyhow, it went down pretty deep until 1997. And then it went up again gradually, slowly, for 10 years until 2007. And then crack, financial and economic crisis, went down again. And then it has been going up since then. But you have to realize that even though the last few years have shown positive growth, history has been made of ups and downs. And another point I'd like to mention is that you should not only look at these 2 indicators. Take a country like Poland. I'll take one example only. The Polish joined the EU with tremendous fears. The fear of being forever second or third class European citizens. The fear of being accused by Western Europeans of being dirty, thieves, cheaters. That was true. It was their feeling. Now they have realized that all of this was a myth, and that they have a way of expressing their views in the EU like other countries, notably other large European countries as they are. And their attitude towards the EU, taking those 2 indicators, has soared. They are now, according to these indicators, among the most pro-European countries. And yet, clearly, the Poles are opposed or very reluctant to a number of EU initiatives. So it's not one-sided.
Have the old founding member states become much
more... The
more...
old member states?
Yes, much more disenchanted with the project over
They have
those
changed
years.
too. They have changed. Back 30 years ago, I would say the southern member states were among the most enthusiastic. That includes France, but even more so Italy, Greece, Spain. Spain, which joined the EU, or the EC, as it was a recognition of their being a democratic country after Francisco Franco Caudillo de España. Okay? They have been through ups and downs again, but they were quite positive. Now, take Italy now. They are one of the most Euro-skeptic countries. And the French are not very much better. the French are, who used to be quite assured of themselves and of their natural intellectual domination over the others. I'm French, so you'll understand.
You can say that.
Have now realized that the world is perhaps a bit more complicated than it was. And if you take the French attitude, it has gone like this, whereas the German attitude has gone like that. I was discussing this with my friend Pascal Lamy some time ago, and he said, no worry, no surprise. The EU was French at the time, it's now German. In terms of intellectual input.
Thank you. Making a little bridge based on what you said. So we could say that overall, the certain skepticism has grown, as I understand, even though there were ups and downs. Now, there's often an impression that the debate about the EU has reduced to basically much more negative emotions than the positive ones recently. And different opinion makers, politicians have started to label each other, you are anti-EU, you are too optimistic, but aren't we missing something there? I mean, you've been, Alisa, researching a lot on the public discourse of the EU support. And is it true that we are really so anti-EU when we criticize, or what have you come to as a conclusion?
Well, first of all, I would like to emphasize that there's a bit more nuance than anti-EU and pro-EU. There's a lot in between those extreme otherwise views, and it's actually pretty healthy criticism, a criticism which we need in order to put forward reforms, in order to become better as a united Europe. But most importantly, so that dichotomy and the variety in between is actually very healthy, and Euroscepticism has been misinterpreted as pure opposition. And I found that this is not the case. So people are critical of the European Union, but not because they oppose it. They're critical because they actually support the idea, because they want a better Europe, because they want a stronger Europe, because they want a united Europe, which actually works, which actually they can be satisfied with what they see as results. And I think that misinterpreting those attitudes as opposition or skepticism in the form of rejection is actually being very tricky, and is not making us a favor in terms of working together and moving forward with European integration. That criticism and also pragmatism, by the way, is illustrated in the discourse, which I find, and here I just would like to emphasize that it's not exactly public discourse, I would call it citizen discourses, because a public discourse would require some media, maybe a lead. I would put some more of communicative interactions in a public discourse as opposed to citizens discourse. And what I've actually studied were the citizens discourses and how citizens themselves would phrase their opinions, how they would basically support, justify, or argue in favor or argue in against, but they also, in between those arguments, there's a lot of just neutral and very kind of logical critics that we should hear.
Did you find out that the people felt that their opinion, their constructive criticism, as I understand your findings, were felt by the decision makers?
I don't really think so, no. I think it's very much framed into anti-EU because that is what sells. That's what sells on the domestic level, right? I mean, for political elites, it is much easier to just see it as a one-sided thing. So it's either pro or anti. And the criticism gets kind of lost in between, but because if you think about the criticism, then you have to do something based on that criticism. You gotta hear it and then act upon it. While just saying the public is anti-EU kind of leaves you relaxed and on the back without taking an action.
So you're basically suggesting it's more a problem of a labeling. Like, yeah, you have a criticism, whomever says so is labeled anti-EU. It recalls me a little bit the recent case of media when I think of Italy, as soon as the new government started. Basically, virtually all the EU news had headlines anti-EU government. Now, if you look under that, you can figure out that probably it's not necessarily true, because this labeling hides, as you suggest, many other elements which could actually help Europe in identifying what is that the citizens want in terms of reform. And it could actually be a way of gathering that information. How do we do that? I mean, how should the European decision makers, political media, opinion makers try to collect that right information? Is there a way the citizens can actually raise up their voice? Kasia?
Well, thank you first of all for inviting me. I'm here as a European citizen. My history of my family is closely connected to Europe and also Eastern Europe. My parents are Polish. I visited my family in Croatia. I saw what happened in the 90s. And my means of speaking about what the European citizens want is being here. I mean, really, like, I became active politically around 2 years ago. I was always a political person, but for me, it's this kind of opening up the stage. I'm not saying that it's bad that researchers or politicians take the stage, but for me, we need more places like this, where people like me can speak. And I'm not a researcher. I can't like throw around with numbers. I'm a theater maker. I think art can be a way of expressing politics. And that's why so I'm also a little bit, I have to say, excited to be here, because this is a very new mode of speaking to you. Usually I sit somewhere and scream, let's do this and this and this. But maybe sometimes we have to think politics more like theater, to open up the stage to the citizen, to have more fun also, to, I don't know, maybe also this kind of atmosphere gives people fear. And maybe this is their idea about Europe, that it's this very stuffed, elitist place where nobody really knows what's happening. And that's why, for me, it's a good move that you invited me here.
Thank you. You have brought up a very interesting element. I had 2 questions, and I will pass to other questions that we are receiving via Slido. You mentioned fun. I have a colleague sitting here who has been doing a lot of work here on the Czech Republic in terms of how do we reach out to the people who are not interested in their daily life in the EU. You all who are here are usually interested, but normal people, simply, they have far too many other chores to deal with, school, kids, family, work. They don't necessarily search for the information on the EU. They don't even need it. And how do we reach out to them? And fun, art, humor can be one of the ways. And you saw the videos we were showing up. That's perhaps an attempt to try to bring to the attention of the public aspects of the EU that touch our daily life, because that is very important for the debate we're having today. We can talk about reforming the European Parliament, we can talk about reforming plenty of institutional questions, but if we don't have citizens behind and knowing what is that we are defending here, then we will not reach it. So what you mentioned, I think it's very important. Have you ever tried to reach out to the people through theater performances in terms of gaining them for the idea of European projects, also maybe within the context of your movement?
We as a movement, DiEM25, are kind of connected to a lot of artists around Europe, so there is definitely the opening and for that. But what I have to talk maybe about, what is more interesting, what is more touchable, is that last year I participated in a project, or I worked for a project that is called the General Assembly, where we actually simulated in theater terms a world parliament. And maybe that sounds utopic, but I actually do believe in utopia, and it was a very interesting moment because we actually brought people that are usually not seen to the stage. And this is maybe something that can help. Or there are different methods, like the forum theater or the theater of the oppressed, which work on the street about discussion of problems, where you really take the street for that. And I think we are kind of developing these ideas also in our movement. We built a little task force in Berlin which is called Creative Resistance. We believe in constructive disobedience. That's why we definitely, with measures of fun, would like to show how we imagine Europe for us.
Daniel, would that work?
Yeah, I think we need about 1,000 people like you in each building in each city of Europe.
Well, there are people like that.
Well, may I just make a few points?
Absolutely.
Or remind you of a few anecdotes. First of all, I remember telling the then Director General for Communication of the Commission a number of years ago that some people in his Directorate General were thinking of using television campaigns to promote the beauties and virtues of the EU and the Commission. And I told him, well, let's be realistic. In terms of budget, to communicate everything you have to communicate to 500 million people in 28 different countries, well, 27 at the time perhaps, you have about the amount of money that Coca-Cola has to communicate on its new label of Coca Light in Luxembourg. Of course, it was a joke. It was exaggerated. But it's true. In terms of resources, financial resources, the Commission has very little to work just by itself. In terms of political censorship from the member states, you probably know much better than I do that there are things that are difficult to say. Another anecdote, if I may. I remember many, many years ago, Mr. Mitterrand, who was then President of the French Republic, and was not branded as an anti-European by far, presenting his Happy New Year message to the French people. That was back in 1988 or 89, I can't remember. And he said, Europe, 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 it's beautiful, fine, etc. But the European Commission should not deal with our cheeses. Okay. There was a recent directive voted which had different aspects, but one of them, he felt, was against the interests of French cheese producers. This aspect which was against French producers was that there was a request for a certain degree of hygiene in cheese producing, okay? And the next day, I listened to the radio program in the morning, the information program, where the president of the French Cheese Federation said, but we asked for that directive. So, member states, governments, even if they are rather pro than anti-European, are not our allies in many cases. So, it's clear the Commission by itself cannot do everything. The governments do not necessarily help. So we need people like you. Without civil society taking the problem in charge, the question, are you confident in the ability of EU institutions and politicians to improve public perception of the EU? The answer is no.
I think it's
which doesn't mean that we should remain idle, all of us.
Thank you. Hasn't been the skepticism, which one question points at as well, bit of a consequence of a wrong communication, both by the institutions at the European level as well as at the national, about EU only as an economic benefit? I mean, this concerns specifically Central European countries who have benefited quite hugely from the EU funds. And where has gone the value debate? Because you've been researching on that as well.
Yeah, I want to add on that. So a few points about communication. First of all, some of the biggest criticism in the Netherlands, in Germany, but also in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, is about communicating. And citizens feel a little bit ignored, a little bit kind of left on the side, a little bit not involved in anything that happens in European integration, and that's actually the source of most of their complaints. It's been more than 50 years of deepening and widening of an institution which never got understood on the level of citizens. And now, after the accession of another 12 member states, and now we are 28 minus 1 or 27 plus 1, we still don't know. Now the effects and the actual, there is more European integration sensed and experienced by citizens. Now they know it's there because they have their everyday life is changing because of European integration, while nobody has informed them on why this is happening, how this is happening, and also where it is going. And Dutch citizens are extremely disappointed with that. They are disappointed, however, predominantly with their own government about not communicating. And that was also one of the reasons for the Dutch referendum to be 60+ % no in 2005, and probably the same reasons were behind the vote in France, other than, of course, immigration from Central and Eastern Europe, which came as a surprise. So enlargement, for example, as a dimension of European integration was not communicated at all, and suddenly Dutch citizens or German citizens started seeing and excuse me for that, Polish plumber, and they did not know where it came from. And that was their complaint. I don't think that they actually have anything against the Polish plumbers or the immigrants. They have against the fact that they were basically put in the dark for so long and suddenly exposed to something they were not ready for. And nobody communicated it. But I wouldn't blame European institutions, and I don't think citizens also put the blame per se on European institutions. It's more of the kind of interaction between domestic institutions, political institutions, and the EU institutions, and kind of the lost communication that then does not reach citizens. And also we have to admit that there is a different set of arguments which play out when coordinating policy on the EU level among political elites. So at the Council, all our leaders go discuss, decide on the basis of a certain set of arguments, be it value-based or identity-based or security-based, but then they go home and they communicate their decisions based on completely different arguments. And then those same things are interpreted in yet a third way through the prism of citizens' own experiences with all that's happening around them and how it affects them. And it does not necessarily affect them well. So there would always be people who would be losing based on either globalization or European integration. You cannot remedy that completely. And there would be always people who would be against further integration. And we find that in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Poland even. And Poland is, according to public, and I want to build on your point that you mentioned earlier, Poland, according to public opinion surveys, is indeed very pro-European. But I do find the discourse which is called rejecting the bureaucratic monster, which complains not for the cheese, but for the size of the cucumbers, or, I mean, in every country there's some kind of an implication of that same story of the cheese, which is 30 years ago, but now you find it again. And that's because citizens simply don't know how those things appear at the first place as policy.
Yeah, thank you. There's one question that fits quite well into that. What are the options for EU politicians to promote the EU when national media and politicians possibly have an interest to maintain the EU as a bad sheep? So that's a very good one, and it's quite points out to this discrepancy between the rhetorics at the European level and at the national level. But I suppose this has always existed. I mean, I don't think this is anything new. Have you noticed that rhetoric was different at the national level than at the European, even in the past?
Sorry, what is not new?
the fact that there is a national rhetoric, you know, that the national politicians, when they come back from the council, when they have decided to come on
No, that's not new at all.
Exactly.
Not new at all. Well, the difference with 30 years back is that at the time there was very little information published in the media about EC affairs. Okay? Today, the amount of information is maybe 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more in terms of volume. And yet people understand rather less. Okay? Why? Well, the rise of populist politicians is certainly one part of it. The other reason is that it is much more complicated than it was. The number of issues the EU deals with, the mechanism, the decision mechanism have become much more complicated, the number of countries has become larger, and the Union is less homogeneous than it used to be. Objectively, it's more difficult. Now, going back to what I said earlier about the limits in budget terms, e-democracy and e-communication is probably one of the ways of communicating, because it's much cheaper than using traditional media communication.
Yes, but at the same time it also reaches to only a certain portion of the population, and it leaves out a lot of people who wouldn't even bother about democracy. And these are people that still have voting rights and would go and vote.
Sure. I don't mean to say that it will easy to do, because we know, all of us, how to what extent internet can be pure rubbish. Okay, but I think there is something to be done in this area, and I think the Commission has begun to reform its communication system.
I mean, social media have become part of everyday life, but also the public has changed, I suppose. I mean, we want things quickly, we want quick emotions, we want information to be understood immediately, so that has really changed the pattern of how the communication about the EU shall be. I wanted to ask Kasia, if within the movement that is basically a grassroots initiative across the whole Europe and has the idea of, again, motivating all the Europeans around the idea of the European project, have you been considering those tools in communicating like the...
Well, what I just read, there was a question about, does the EU need other symbols or museums? No, please. What I'm talking about and what our movement is talking about is participation. And this is not about quick, yay, press release, yay, Europe is so cool. No, what we need, and this is democracy, and this is not quick. Participation means meeting people on the street, speaking to them. And also, democracy is something where it's conflictive, and it takes time. And what we as a movement, of course, we try new artistic tools that are maybe called culture jamming, or looking how we can use social media to influence kind of and see how can we bring our discourse into the social media. But what we also do as a grassroots movement is be on the street. And there are people, I'm from the Berlin bubble, which is of course intellectual, activist, blah, 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 but there's people in our movement which come from small towns in southern Germany, and they're older, and they go really on the street with their little political tools. And I still believe that in these times of pace, we also need to think politics and democracy as something participative, but it needs to go into the hands of the citizen. Other than that, this whole idea will burst. So I do believe that.
So you're suggesting that there are limits to what we can do through social media and internet, etc., and that we still shall go back to the proper campaigning among the people?
I think we need both. So our movement really tries to be in touch with academics, artists, activists, so we can kind of, because, populism is also using tools.
Have you gathered information from your different experiences that there is demand among population, that people go among outside? Because also, at least in this country, and I suppose in quite many countries, people have withdrawn to their homes with their laptop, social media, Netflixes, etc. And there are much less social activities than in the past. And whether this is not also limiting, and is there really a demand? among citizens so that there are stands, there is involvement on the streets and discussion through those difficult subjects?
Yeah, I agree. As far as I'm concerned, the local bar in my village is the place where I convinced, sorry, no, I didn't convict anybody, convinced the largest number of people that Europe was a good thing. And that is missing more and more. So I try to go to the local bar as often as possible.
Very good. Eliza?
Well, I'm not sure if I completely agree with you on not needing symbols, because identity and values need symbols to be maintained, to be also to blossom to a certain extent, and the EU is lacking the symbols which otherwise national states have.
But that's the interesting thing, it's not. But what kind of symbols? And the EU was founded upon humanity, solidarity. These are symbols, but we're not using them.
These are values.
Yeah, but they're also symbols for something.
But how are they symbols if they're not somehow manifested?
We have a nice example of how the citizens' debate should take place in each member state among citizens. This leads me to the initiative of President Macron and his consultation publique. We have a similar tool as the European Commission in the, to discuss with public. Is it really working? Do you think there is some positive effect into that? I mean, will people really go and discuss the EU project in such events?
I'm not sure I'm able to give an answer to that question. What I heard, because I didn't follow closely what is going on, what I heard is that they find it more difficult to carry out that investigation than they thought. Okay? But I think it's a bloody good idea overall. We plan at the Institut Jacques Delors to publish a paper at the end of the process, assuming we have enough information to give. For the moment, I'm not able to say anything. But it's obviously a good initiative.
Yes, Eliza.
Well, I would like to refer to something that earlier was introduced in one of the keynote speeches, and I do believe that we have common values as human beings, and then as Europeans, and then as Bulgarians, Romanians, French, German, and so on. And indeed, I think freedom, democracy, rule of law, we all strive towards those, and the European Union is a platform and an instrument that allows us to actually strive for more of those. And I think we should emphasize exactly on those values, because values are much more enduring as an argument in support of further integration, or of integration as it is now, than any benefit, an economic benefit, because as we've seen, an economic crisis hits, there's no economic benefit, and then support based on that is dropping down right away. While arguments which you find, for example, in the discourse on, that was kind of the glue of the Eastern enlargement, which was the reunification of Europe and the return to Europe for Central and Eastern Europe, these arguments are still there, and we still find them both in the Netherlands and in Poland in very strong pro-European supportive discourses, and they do appear as a common force towards unity.
What to do about divisions that we have been noticing in Europe over last years between North and South around the Euro crisis, between West and East in relation to migration? I mean, there are clearly some topics that are achievement in one member state or in a certain part of Europe and is welcomed, and it's a failure and a disaster in other member states. So how can we solve that dilemma and communicate positively about the EU when there are really some differences that are rather fundamental?
Well, having the answer to that is of course bloody difficult. Clearly there is a growing gap between North and South, although in early years the gap had narrowed thanks to the structural funds. But the gap has come up greater, it has become greater again. Think of Italy, think of Greece, and their attitudes towards countries more to the north. Spain is a different story. They are recovering from a number of years of pessimism. But overall, this north-south gap has widened out of economic issues mainly. You have a West-East gap, although this is too schematical, of course, over immigration issues. That's clear. We did a study on the Visegrad countries recently, or we analyzed the results on the Visegrad countries. Obviously, they don't have the same views as Mrs. Merkel, or as the new Spanish government. And the gap has widened. Now, and there are probably other issues which are potentially a source of controversy. Think of attitudes toward the US. I know there's a panel dealing with that over here. And attitudes towards the plan to have a European defense policy. Will the Poles join? Whereas they still have a very strong link with the US? I'm not sure. This could be another divide. My worry, there has always been a number of controversial issues between EU member states. My worry is that we hear about a two-speed Europe, okay? My worry is to avoid having a 27-speed Europe.
Take point. Would you like to comment
Yes.
on the divide and how do we overcome it?
Because you were speaking about the division. I do believe, and that is my way of dealing with it, that overcoming the idea of the nation state as our movement, as we try, could be the way, because we are thinking, the Greek are thinking this, the Spanish are thinking this, but this is, as you said, different. I mean, there are different opinions, so I do think we have to politicize the idea of Europe with differing opinions. Our opinion of DiEM25 is something that takes workers' rights very strongly, so we believe in the strengthening of workers' rights in Europe. We do believe in open borders and in integration and humanity, and this is but something that I may be differing with my neighbor in Berlin,
sure,
but not with someone in Paris or in Belgrade. So this is the way we approach these, that these divisions are something that is for me political and not bound to the nation state. And this is
sorry, just a word.
Daniel.
my thing.
What you say brings to my mind another point. Communicating the EU, explaining EU policies is of course necessary, will become ever more necessary. But another strong point is to have people from different countries meeting each other. If I had a choice, sorry, because you are in the DG communication universe, if I had a choice between multiplying by 3 the budget of your DG or multiplying by 3 the budget of Erasmus, I would choose the second option.
Elisa?
Yeah, I would add to that. I'm absolutely for multiplying the Erasmus. I think people should move around more, and that brings familiarity, and that basically meeting and discussing together kind of mitigates the fears that we have from our differences and our perceptions of our differences, because there's more often perceptions about differences than actual differences, because bottom line is that we strive for security, for safety, for freedom, and we all do, but there's those kind of embedded differences based on either nation-state kind of building through education, through culture, through all kinds of other, we know how the nation-state has been born, but there's also a bit of a danger in trying to circumvent the nation-state, especially right now when nationalism is on the rise. And because you might it might fire back at you if you want to say, yeah, nation state does not matter. That is a dangerous precedent, and it might actually result in a counter effect that we are not seeking. It's not to say that you're not right, and that is not the case. So the ideas of nation state and of national identity definitely somewhat hamper the building of European identity, but then I believe that we need to embed one into the other and understand both the similarities and the differences among them.
Thank you. I would like to devote now more time to the questions that are on the screen that our audience has been liking. And allow me just add to that I see another limitation to this basically vertical communication about the EU, a language. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily most of the people speak languages of others, so let's talk about critical mass. I think language itself might be also a difficulty. But first question that Gain most likes, and we have touched upon that a little bit, but we haven't really discussed it thoroughly, it sounds like that. What are your views on the role of e-democracy tools as a way to directly involve EU member state citizens in the debates on the future of our European Union? Daniel.
Well, I said a word earlier. I think, of course, it's a tool to be developed and used. Although I don't know how, because I'm not a specialist.
We are cooperating in Germany with a party which is called Demokratie in Bewegung, Democracy Movement, and they actually try out these e-democratic tools for their own party and movement to find out opinions. So this is maybe another question because it is directed, but it's in the end the idea of how can we use this technological tool to rethink democracy and participate in its way.
Wouldn't that fit within in your manifesto and in your European Spring paper? There is the idea of European Constitutional Assembly. Wouldn't that tool fit within that?
I do think so. I don't, well, we are a big crowd, so I'm not the digital expert here, as you know.
Have you thought
but
of that?
I do believe that when our goal to go into the idea of a European Constituent Assembly, that using these tools to find out opinions on certain ideas. I still am a fan of the local meeting of the people and speaking with each other, so there's ideas also of citizens' assemblies. Maybe you all heard about this idea of bringing citizens together, debating on solutions, but I do think that could be a way. Well, but there are probably more specialists about that.
So would you like to add something to the role of the e-democracy tools? Aren't we over-evaluating?
I think we should definitely, given that we do have those tools, we should definitely use them, but we should not...
Who shall use them? National governments or European institutions?
Both.
Municipalities?
Municipalities as well, because actually, and I really like what Pavel Fischer said in one of our meetings a few days ago. People tend to trust their local governments the most, in general, because they're closest to them. There's something that they see directly and that they can also criticize more directly and have input on that level. So I think on all levels we should use those tools, but we should not use them to the extent that we undermine actual democratic tools. So I think...
a complementary tool then.
Yeah. As an add-up, as a kind of an additional inertia, if you wish, yes, but we should not undermine actual democracy on national level, on local level, because after all, the European Union is a union of democratic states, and I think the democratic deficit that we've been discussing, and it's such a catchy phrase for the last 25 years in public opinion studies, can be remedied not only through e-democracy, but to actually political elites on all levels hearing what citizens have to say, but also informing them correctly and not lying to them. And I would say lying instead of fake news, because as I mentioned earlier to you, fake news is a very catchy and fancy and fun word to use, and people don't really realize what implications it has to how we understand the world around. If you call it lies or propaganda, maybe people would think about the information that they receive, and they'll be a bit more critical of how they deal with that information when they go to the polls.
We call it disinformation formally because it's much broader. I will then ask you to comment a question on the degree. Well, that's an interesting one. Could degree of skepticism be broken down more by age, gender, wealth, ethnicity, rather than by a country? Because it's true, so far we've been mentioning countries, because that's how our opinion polls work usually. But Chatham House report highlights 6 stripes. Can we actually relate to the different societal groups in different member states? And do we actually have data on that? so that we could target communication better?
Women in all countries have common interests, I suppose. Equality between men and women has been one policy very much supported by the EU. And I'm sure there are exchanges between different countries, between organizations that share the same interests. But more widely, I would say skepticism could possibly be broken down by making people having the same interests in contact with each other. Is that not clear? No. I'm thinking of a study I did for the Commission many years ago over town twinning.
Yes.
Okay? Well, town twinning can be just a way for city councilmen to meet each other and have a good meal every second year. Okay? But it can be more than that if you involve the local people. And I remember one of my counterparts in the Commission saying, but we have the language barrier. And it was just one maybe stupid idea. Said, if you take to the other country, let's say a carpenter, to meet the French carpenter, to meet a Bulgarian carpenter, even if they don't speak any word of each other's language, they can see how the other does things. Yeah. It's only one very limited example, just an illustration of the way that we should try to identify common interests between people who apparently have nothing to do with each other in terms of age, nationality, or whatever.
If I can build on that, indeed, what we find in the discourse in 6 completely different countries with different experiences with EU membership and integration itself, we find that, so our study has been done in the native languages, and even though it's in the different languages, we do find common overarching arguments, both in favor and also against. So it's more about the ideas and the arguments that people share as opposed to their personal characteristics of age and because as one example that is really an overarching theme across the different countries and in the different languages is the fact that EU is a union of common standards, common norms, common rules, common ideas, if you wish, and that comes across in Serbian, in Macedonian, in Bulgarian, in German, in Dutch, and I bet probably in Spanish, in French, and so on and so forth. And that would be irrespective of gender, age, or wealth.
Another idea that the former president of the Commission had many years ago was to promote passive learning of other languages. It's not easy to learn a foreign language. No? It's not easy. And we have one dominating language being used today, which tends to monopolize the learning of other languages. It's not easy to learn a second language, a third language, etc. But promoting some passive knowledge of the other's language is less difficult to do and perhaps more fruitful or more realistic. Okay?
But we basically don't dispose of that data, I gather. It would be very interesting in my view, and I suppose in the view of the public. Kasia, would you like to add something to this?
Well, I would like to add to the idea, because there was also a question about transnational lists, which is for me something, again, what you were saying, there are maybe citizens from different countries can meet under another umbrella, not just nation, it can be found somewhere else. This is what we try, actually, with our transnationalist European Spring. And we have partners like Génération S in France, Razem in Poland, Alternatividad in Denmark, and Livre in Portugal and others. And there's the try to say, with the same program, people can vote on the same program, but they can live wherever. They can live on the Portuguese coast or on the Polish coast. But that is our idea, actually, to bring about that kind of inspiration and questioning. Maybe it will fail, I don't know, but the idea is to bring an impulse
with e-democracy tools. Well, the time is coming to the end. I wanted to give as much space as possible to the questions that Kind most likes. And I will ask the last one from the Slido, and then we'll ask one from the public if you have somebody who wants to ask. So, what are your views on Talos EU, a civic tech tech startup that empowers EU citizens to launch European citizens' initiatives and European Parliament e-petitions?
Well, we know it now. We can Google it.
I suppose we don't dispose enough elements of that. So if you allow me, I will jump to the next one, because I don't think any of our panelists have elements on that. Does the EU have the potential to limit the impact of populism on public opinion? Does the EU have any effective instrument in this area? I think that's quite a relative one, the important one.
It can be linked with the next question too.
In many EU member states, there is very strong pressure against EU, even though these countries earn a lot of money from the EU budget. How is that possible? I think we touched upon that question when we talked about the rhetoric of defending the EU using the economic arguments only, because as soon as you have a crisis, that economic argument doesn't work anymore. On the other hand, the values you mentioned are not very appealing to the general public, unfortunately. So can I ask you to answer this question about, do we really have a ability to limit the impact of populism?
Well, I, as a theater person, can just quote Bertolt Brecht, in the sense that we, as European citizens, and I think we can learn from this. This was written 1929, that we shouldn't forget as humans that we are human. Yeah. And I don't know, but this is I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'll have a brief and maybe a bit stupid answer. Do not leave the field to those who are against. No? I remember being asked by the Commission to do a study at the time of the treaty in 2005, and you remember the French referendum ended up in a no, in the Dutch referendum too, and we did that study in January. The referendum was a couple of months later. The number of people, according to opinion polls, who said they would vote yes was between 60 and 65% at the time, and it ended up being 47.5%, I believe. But we could feel signs that it was not as obvious as it seemed to win that referendum. And what happened is that those politicians and parties who were in favor of the yes just left the field open to the opponents for 2 months. And it ended up in a no.
Elsa, would you like to add something to that question?
Yes, I'm a little confused, to be honest, and I'll be very honest on this one. I'm not sure what exactly the impact of populism on public opinion means, given that populism is kind of a way to align with the popular views, which should be the public opinion. I mean, in my head, the logic is a little bit reversed, and populism is somewhat of a result of some public opinion trends or some unspoken public opinion trends, if I may, that some politicians are very capable of touching upon and like sensing in order to capitalize for their own, maximization of votes, I would call it. So that would be my answer on that particular question.
Thank you. Is there anybody who wants to ask anything?
I think
before I conclude?
The gentleman had a question there. Oh.
There was a gentleman here who raised a hand before.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Andrej Matišak. I'm a journalist from Slovakia. One remark and one question, if I may. Just a small remark as a journalist. A couple of times it was mentioned that there is a kind of a division between what our politicians are saying in Brussels and then what they are saying to the voters. Honestly, forget about it. I mean, really, if it is not too extreme, every politician will do that. every time. They are sitting in the council, they are talking to their colleagues, and every colleague knows that then politicians will hit the elevator, and at the press conference they will talk to the voters. So everybody knows that. As I said, if it is not too extreme, I hear that all the time, and I'm a little bit tired about it, because it will be all the time like this. I'm sorry, but that's how I feel it, you know. I challenge politicians if they are going into some really too extremes to change the tune, but otherwise, I do not believe it is possible to change it, and I don't even think that it is really, let's direct our energy into something more concrete than to this. That's just my remark. And one question, if I may, there were a few discussion about divisions, for example, East-West, and there was also this question about that we received money and how that we don't like EU. I think we can talk about it. This is not so easy, in fact, I would say, one thing, because we also gave something to the EU. But my question is, how we can, it was mentioned, for example, Erasmus and those things, but do you think that we need something like and of course it is probably almost impossible to establish, but something like a more common history of the EU? Because you mentioned a couple of times Mr. Delors, 1985. This is nothing for Slovakia. In 1995, we have been there was a stagnation of communism in my country. Mr. Delors is basically nobody in my country, honestly, if people are not really interested in European Union. So do you think it would be helpful, or maybe just scrap the idea to somehow know each other better also on this kind of a historical level? As I said, I also been a teacher, in fact, not a journalist, and when I was very young, there was so do you think that this is possible, or this is not even worth to try? To have this kind of common history.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
The question was about whether we should not have a common European history, like a perception of it, so that we relate to it and relate to the whole European project much more.
Yeah, I totally agree. Some years ago, there was a Franco-German plan to publish a common history book, okay, which was not used very much, but it was this kind of initiative, I think, which is to be done. No, it's a history program for school children, okay, in order to have. Well, the French are convinced that Karl der Große was 100% French. Okay? And the Germans are convinced that Charlemagne was 100% German. Well, the plan was to try and convince people that history was a bit more complex, that there were periods where countries were at peace with each other, at war with each other, etc. But that we had much more in common than we thought. And I think this kind of initiative would, of course, be great. If we could do it at a pan-European level, it would be great. What I've always noticed is that when you make people from different countries meet each other, they generally feel they have more in common than they thought.
Yeah. Kasia, and brief comments because they have to conclude.
Yeah.
You
go
first.
for it. Yeah? All right. So 2 things on your comments. I do agree with you that we do have common history. What we need is common interpretation of history, and basically to agree on what's the interpretation of the different events that we all know have been key in history making in both European integration and in general for the future of Europe altogether. And so that's on the history. But on your remark that the story of the Chinese whisperer with the EU, then domestic, where is the role of media? And I'll come with a counter kind of question. You're a journalist, I also have a journalistic background, but where is the media in that broken connection of communication?
You can talk about it afterwards.
But then, just a food for thought on this one.
You can talk about that afterwards.
I can maybe say something more personal about that, because it's interesting that I grew up in Hamburg, Germany, and I actually Eastern European history, or even the history of the East Germany, isn't really taught. So a lot of people from my school and my uni have no idea what was communism? What happened? What happened in the 90s? I had to learn it by myself, through traveling, through speaking with people, through reading a wonderful book from Svetlana Alexeyevich about the 90s in Russia. But it's something that is kind of, people don't know it. It's crazy. And so I feel like there's, like, you can't really speak to each other because people don't really know this. So I do believe, I'm not a fan of the same interpretation of history. This can be somehow totalitarian sometimes, but I'm a fan of like getting this knowledge out. And maybe also in the end, that's what history is for me, is learning about history. And the same arguments are happening right now. It's that's why.
Thank you very much, Kasia. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Alica. And thank you very much to all of you who have listened to us. I gather from all these exchanges basically 4 points, which I will take with myself as a EU Commission employee. And the first one is that use creative communication tools. We talked about art, we talked about humor, we talked about emotion. So that's something we all should, who have something to do with the communication, do. Second, don't be afraid communicating about values. Too often, too much, we have reduced the EU only to the economic benefit. We can't relate to that in long term. I mean, what brings us all together as a nation, as I gathered from your exchanges, and you all come from different countries, is that you all can agree on certain basic fundamental values. Let's try advice and whomever we talk to communicate more EU through its values it represents. Third, stop labeling anti-EU everybody who says anything critical about the EU, so that you can actually hear some more arguments and perhaps contribute to changes and make people talk to each other more. And also from what you said, Daniel, I gather that we have been in wars, so we're in war situations in the past. No. So I think it's not so gloomy, and we do have a positive perspective. Yes, last words.
One last suggestion as a joke again. The plan to send all youngsters, European youngsters, for 2 or 3 years out of Europe. When they come back, they realize that they are bloody Europeans and the others are not.
On that note, thank you all very much, and I wish you a very nice evening.
Thank you.